We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and I always look forward to speaking with Professor Richard Wolff. As you know, Richard Wolff is an economist and economic historian, a professor, I believe, emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as a visiting professor at New York University. He's the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, which is also a podcast you should check out, and a radio show. I always appreciate our discussions. It's been a little while since I've been ill. So first of all, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Welcome back. It's good to see that you are back from the ranks of the ill and back in good form.
Yeah, it's good to be here. As the saying goes, it's good to be anywhere. But So the world moved on while I did not. And the latest news here in Washington, D.C., the headlines are this bizarre crisis, or we're told it's a crisis, but then we're told maybe it's not a crisis, this debt ceiling business. And the Republicans who hold one chamber of commerce, Freudian slip there. The Republicans who hold one chamber of Congress have laid out a set of demands. Everybody's reading about it. I don't think the media particularly does a good job of explaining what it is and how we got to this point. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because I feel like underlying tectonic forces are at work here. So what about this debt ceiling crisis?
Yeah, I mean, you're being very kind, RJ, that the press and media have not done a good job. That is certainly the nicest conceivable choice of language with which to describe it. Systematically misleading would have been my choice, but I'm not as delicate or diplomatic as you are. And I'm probably wrong in being blunter. Let me explain and just start off to make sure everybody's on the same page. It is the job of the federal government to raise taxes in order to spend that money on things the society needs. And that includes maintaining roads and highways, providing a defense of the country militarily, providing the pensions that the Social Security system guarantees to working people, subsidizing hospitals and universities in various ways, conducting research, a space program, and all the other things. And the Congress is basically with the president, but it's really the job of the Congress to make a determination about how much taxes to raise in order to undertake the spending that the government provides, both to corporations and businesses on the one hand, and to people, wage earners, salary earners on the other. It is at the discretion of the government to raise taxes less than the spending it does, or to spend more than the taxes it raises. If and when the Congress decides either of those things to do that, it has to make up the difference by borrowing the money. In other words, if it spends more than it raises in taxes, it borrows the difference. And if it taxes less than whatever it's spending, again, it borrows the difference. So it's all the responsibility of the government. Here comes then the problem. Politicians in this capitalist system face absurd contradictory demands. Corporations and businesses on the one hand, and people want the government to spend on them. Corporations want the government to protect foreign trade so they can make a profit from it. Corporations want the government to subsidize research in universities and elsewhere to help them develop new techniques, new products. They want the government to maintain the road system, the railroad system, the airports, so that commerce can function. And individuals want a proper retirement to let them live out their later years in dignity, and a whole lot of public school support and all the other things that the government does. So they all have demands, and yet the corporations and the individuals do not want to pay taxes because that's money out of their pocket. The poor politician, and I say poor in quotation marks, is caught in the middle. What's the politician going to do? Dares not tax corporations because they will then bring in a different group of politicians in a hurry by moving their donations and all from candidate A to candidate B. And they're afraid of doing it to the public too, because then they'll lose the votes, which they need to stay politicians. And by the same token, they dare not cut the spending on either of those two groups because that will upset those groups. So here's what the politicians do. They spend to keep those people happy, and they avoid taxing to keep those people happy, with the result that they borrow more and more money. In recent years, in the trillions, with a T, amount of borrowing. And the problem is, that's not a good solution. That's a sign of a system that's very badly organized, because if you keep borrowing, you put the government in a difficult situation. For example, today, out of every dollar we are taxed, a good portion of it goes to pay interest to all those who lent to the government when the politicians taxed inadequately to cover the spending, etc. And that's a burden on future generations. That's a burden on our society now. And because of that, and because the public said, hey, stop it, the Congress decided to put, here we go, a ceiling on the amount of borrowing. That's the amount of what's called the debt ceiling. It's an artificial cap decided by Congress so that they limit themselves, okay? Periodically, because they didn't solve the underlying problem, which is so typical of Congress, they kept spending and not taxing, with the result they kept on bumping up against the ceilings they had set. Many times over the last 30 years, the ceiling has been bumped up, and the Congress has decided to raise the ceiling so they could borrow more. This is stupid. This is a virtually case study of kicking the can down the road rather than solving the problem the can presents. And here we are yet again at that same moment when the government is being pressed to spend, at the same time not to tax, so it therefore has to borrow, but it can't because that ceiling is there. All right? Solution every other time. Raise the ceiling. The Republicans today are threatening to not raise the ceiling, to block the raising of the ceiling. Well, if they carry through with that, it means the government will either have to raise taxes or cut spending because they're blocked from borrowing. They can't do what they've been doing every year for the last 40 or 50. That's the issue. And the Republicans have now said, we will allow the ceiling to go up, but only if you do the kinds of things we in the Republican Party like. You have to cut spending on poor people. You have to cut spending on working people. You have to cut all this spending because that's the issue. Either you cut the spending or the ceiling won't be raised. And if that happens, wow, then the government will not be able to function. It'll have to start cutting off its activity because it won't be able to borrow, so it won't be able to fund the spending. And then the question becomes, what spending will the government not do? Well, they might not give checks to people on Social Security, or they might not give the government the money needed to fight the war in Ukraine, or they might not fill in the blank. We don't know. The government just can't spend, and therefore, who knows what's going to happen? So lurid stories can be told about how the world will collapse, the American economy will be seen to be chaotic, the dollar will become even more avoided around the world because nobody wants to be involved in a country that's unable to function like this. The Democrats come back and say, we want to raise the ceiling. We don't want there to be cutoffs of Social Security or anything else. You have to do it. And if you don't, all of the bad consequences, we, the Democrats, will blame on you, the Republicans. So that's the theater going on. Now, very quickly, I'm sorry to take so long. Very quickly, here's the reality. It is possible to make the whole debt ceiling issue go away. There's no need to borrow more. The putting of ceilings was intended to stop or at least slow the borrowing. And here's how we can do it. Raise taxes. If you raise the taxes needed to fund the spending that the government is doing, there'd be no need to borrow more, and therefore the ceiling would be irrelevant. The real reason the theater is set up in this way is to avoid confronting the fact that we need tax increases in this country to have the spending on the one hand we need without the bad borrowing on the other hand, which we want to avoid. The solution, raise taxes. The fear of corporations and the rich in America is if we have an honest discussion of raising taxes, the overwhelming majority of us will want to tax corporations and the rich because they can afford it the best, and the rest of us are overburdened with our wages and taxes as it is. They don't even want that conversation to be begun. And so we're told it's either raise the ceiling or cut spending. Notice what's left out of the theatrical debate, raising the taxes. And if you want, RJ, I can give you quickly 3, 4, 5 tax increases we ought to have in America that would solve this problem in 10 minutes.
So before we get into that, Richard Wolff, let's just stop for a second. One of the Democrats' arguments, counter arguments to the Republicans, is that Congress has already spent this money. So in effect, they're saying you already ran up the credit card bill. Now you don't want to write the check to American Express or whomever. So you're defaulting on a commitment you made. And they point out that I think only 1 or 2 other countries in the world have anything similar mechanism where you the legislature spends money and then retroactively decides if it's going to pay it or not. And that does seem like a bizarre arrangement, doesn't it, if that's correct?
Well, it's only half correct. It's mostly a talking point because it appeals to people's notion, gee, if you've already spent the money and the bill is outstanding, it's only proper that you pay the bill for whatever it is you purchased. Yeah, it's half true. Some of the things have been committed to. So in some sense, the bill is coming for stuff that has been either delivered or the contract for it to be delivered is in effect. But there are other things where that is not the case. We could cut back on our defense spending in all kinds of ways. Right. We could cut back on so we can tell the people in Social Security, look, all we have with you is a moral obligation. You've been putting this money aside. We've been taking it out of your check for all your working life. And we kind of told you all along that this would be the funding to give you a pension after you're age 65 or 66 and so on. We're terribly sorry. If you read the fine print, it always said somewhere buried in the language that nobody ever read that this is all subject to the available funds that the government has. Well, it doesn't have the available funds. Yeah, but that's because you cut taxes under Mr. Trump in December of 2017 that were the greatest tax cut for business and the rich we've ever seen, and that's the reason. Yeah, but we did it, so we don't have the money, so we're really sorry. You'll have to switch from a hamburger to dog food to get by. That's our sad thing. The government has discretion. Technically, by the way, the government has already run out of money. It did that 2 months ago, and it has been taking those steps it can take at this point in the judgment of Secretary Janet Yellen of the Treasury. For example, the government is supposed to put money into the pension funds of federal employees. It hasn't done so. It has, quote unquote, delayed making it. Those are legally required, but they're able to delay them. And that way they can tell this story of theater. Let me give you, if you don't mind, some of the taxes, which not only would make the whole debt ceiling problem go away, but would also have very good side effects that are very important to the American people. Okay, let's start with Social Security. Social Security is only applied to the first $160,000 a year that a person earns. Every dollar over 160,000, you do not pay your Social Security tax. You don't, and the employer doesn't. Why in the world is that the case? Why are we telling millionaires that most people who earn $1 million or more, the vast majority of what they earn is not taxed for the pensions we offer to our fellow elderly citizens? If we applied the Social Security tax to all incomes, not just to those 160 or less, we would earn a huge extra amount of money for the federal government. And who would it come from? The richest people amongst us. And if that isn't moving closer to what most Americans think is fair, then I don't know what is. Let me give you another example. Social Security, which maintains our elderly. It's a basic program to maintain people who have given a lifetime of work to this society. It is only applied to wages and salary income. It is not applied to your dividends that you get from owning stock. It's not applied to the capital gains you earn from buying and selling stock. It's not levied on interest you earn if you have bonds that pay you interest, and so on. The kind of income gotten by the richest people in America, the richest people don't get their wealth from wages and salaries most of the time. They get it from dividends, capital gains, and their portfolio of stocks and bonds. To apply Social Security only to wages and salaries is to apply it to the bottom 3/4 of the American income distribution and give a tax holiday to those at the top. Since every poll I've seen indicates that Americans want less inequality, not more, a proper tax on all sources of income to fund the payments to people on Social Security would have the following benefits. It would make this country less unequal. It would immediately take care of the finances of the Social Security system so we don't hear scary stories about that system running out of money 5, 10, or 15 years from now. So it has really good side effects. But I'm only getting started. Here's another one. Up until a few decades ago, the corporate income tax, the tax on corporate profits, was in the neighborhood of 50%. And it was that for many years in America. Now it's 37%. What's that about? Why are we doing that? If we return the tax to where it was for a long time, a period of time, footnote, where the economic growth rate of the United States was greater than it is now, that would generate an enormous increase in government revenue. And here's the final one. I could keep going, but I know we're limited in time. We have what's called an inheritance or an estate tax. It means that if you leave wealth to your children or to anybody when you die, the government gets a piece of that. Up until not that many years ago, when I was already an adult, so it's not ancient history, the amount of money that you could leave to your relatives when you die without it being taxed was $600,000. Okay? What that basically meant was that all middle and lower income people were not affected by this tax because they didn't have that much wealth to leave to anybody at the end of their lives. Okay? So there was no reason to raise the amount that didn't have to pay tax because you were already only hitting people wealthy enough to leave their progeny $600,000 or more. Okay, what did the United States Congress do? It kept raising the amount you could inherit without paying tax. For a couple today, a married couple, the amount of money they can leave to their children is over $25 million, from 600,000 to all that does is take all those people who are leaving wealth to their children in the millions of dollars and give them a tax cut, a big fat tax cut. It makes a mockery of the idea that we are all equal in America. We're all born, and then our future, our well-being, the jobs we get, the educations we get, on a level playing field. We all use our capabilities to do the best we can. Oh, no. That was what an inheritance tax was passed for, to give us a roughly equal chance. Lifting the limit so that you can leave $25 million right now if you die to your children gives your children an advantage that not 1/2% of your fellow citizens enjoy.
So if I work for a living,
yes,
which I do, I'm pay taxes on my income above a certain amount. But if I inherit $25 million from mommy and daddy, never going to happen. But if I did, no taxes at all. My 25 million. So let me give you a counter argument that we hear from the right this time. We hear from the right. The typical Wall Street Journal editorial or whatever, that if you taxed all the billionaires and all the corporations however much you wanted, it still wouldn't be enough to cover the federal spending deficit. To which, I haven't done the math, but A, that sounds like a good idea anyway, whether it covers it or not. But B, but that's the counter argument. No, there's not enough money there to do what you want to do. And I guess what's your response to that?
Well, my response is to remind everyone, not only was the corporate tax 50% more or less for many decades, I want to remind people what the individual income tax, the highest rate, was, say, in 1950s and into the 60s. It was about 90%. It oscillated between 70 and 90%. And we didn't have to borrow anything like the quantities of money we're borrowing now. In other words, it turned out that by having higher corporate taxes and higher personal income taxes, we were able to fund a very good program of government spending without borrowing, therefore without having to put a ceiling on the bar. None of those shenanigans were a problem. And I'm convinced we would be in the same place now. Look, it is possible. I'm not going to argue otherwise. It is possible that if we did a proper job in taxing corporations and the rich the way we used to, we would then, even then, be short on the money we're spending for people. And I would be willing, if that were the case, to sit down and talk about how we solve that problem. The problem that even if we tax in a fair way, there may still be some cutting of spending. Let's face that if it's true. Let's discuss it, and let's come up with a fair reduction of spending so that we can match it to the taxes we raise without borrowing more, which almost everybody agrees is not a good idea. That would be a reasonable way to proceed. The Republicans are not doing that. They don't want to. They talk about a ceiling versus spending cuts. Notice the game. They have removed one option as if it weren't there. There are lies by commission and there are lies by omission. That's a lie by omission because they're afraid of any kind of honest talk about raising taxes is going to come down on the richest people, which is, after all, where it should come down, and especially in a country where poll after poll shows the overwhelming majority of Americans believe that wealth and income are too unequally distributed. So we can meet what those people want. We can salvage the Social Security system, and we can finally have a budget that doesn't require mammoth increase in borrowing. Let me appeal to one more political person on the other side of the aisle. Ranking the number 1 and 2, you might wonder, are the countries of Japan and People's Republic of China. Those are the 2 largest creditors. In other words, when the American government borrows, who does it borrow from? Answer: rich people and corporations, because the rest of us have no money to do that. It also borrows from foreign governments. China owes a little under $1 trillion of U.S. government debt. That means we have to pay them interest. If you assume it's roughly 4%, and it's in that neighborhood, that means that the United States government is raising taxes from all of us, you, RJ, me, and everybody watching or listening. And that money, roughly $40 billion a year, we pay in taxes to the government of the United States in Washington, which turns around and delivers the money to the People's Republic of China, which can use it to beef up its army. Okay, that's one of the costs of a system like the one we have. And raising the ceiling makes that worse. And,
well, let me ask you about another dimension of that. Okay. I mean, that's obviously significant and important. People should understand that. But something that people don't talk about much in all of this discussion of the debt and interest on the government debt and so on, it makes me, FDR, I think it's an apocryphal story, but Roosevelt supposedly said when he was talking with his economic advisors, got confused and said, what the hell? It's all our money, isn't it? That the fact is that we have the Federal Reserve, which is the creation of the U.S. government,
yes,
creating money, giving it to banks, private banks. Private banks are turning around, lending money to the U.S. government. The U.S. government is paying interest to the banks, the same banks that it's periodically rescuing, the same banks. It lets the mid-sized ones go under, or it cuts a deal for the largest corporate criminal in history, in my view, J.P. Morgan Chase, to acquire it instead. But nobody ever stops and says, wait a minute, we're generating this bank profit and then we're paying them. What the hell? Isn't it all our money? Help me with that.
No, I mean, it's exactly correct. This is it's a system built up over the years with the government constantly being called in by the private sector, except when the private sector is making private profit, then it wants the government nowhere near them. But if they break down, if they fail, then the government comes in to rescue them. If it looks crazy to you, it is. I mean, let me pick up on the last point you made. The same United States government that in 2008 and 9 designated J.P. Morgan Chase one of the, quote, banks too big to fail, a bank already so large that if it failed, if it made the kind of blunders that the Silicon Valley Bank made a couple of months ago, it would take the whole system down. That's what it meant. Too big to fail means that we can't let it fail because it'll take us with it. So what did the government just do when the First Republic Bank collapsed because it didn't manage its business properly? The government came in, solved the terrible problem of the collapsed First Republic Bank by selling it to J.P. Morgan Chase, thereby making a bank already designated too big to fail even bigger. I mean, this shows you this is a government that cannot solve the problems anymore. The way it solves one problem is to make another one worse. Then it comes in to solve the one it made worse, and then makes another one even worse. This is chaos. That's why people say correctly, they're not banksters. They're not bankers. They're banksters. To make the connection, this is a hustle. This is a jerry-rigged operation in which they all save each other at the popular expense. We, the people, are the ones on the hook to pay interest on the government debt. These clowns in Washington make the debt when they don't have to placate corporations and the rich when they don't have to, and we're saddled with the interest costs of the debts they use to keep this hustle going. And that includes the deal made with J.P. Morgan Chase over the First Republic Bank. It includes the bailout of the Silicon Valley Bank, and so on. And it was the same story 12 years ago in the crash of 2008 and 9, when the same banks were bailed out again and given all these gifts. People should not shy away from the understanding that this is a game. This is not necessary. These people are playing a game. That's why they have to hide from us the obvious, simple economic statement that if you have a problem with your national debt, if you have placed a ceiling so you can't borrow more, then you have to go look at your taxes and spending so you don't have to borrow more. Instead, these clowns pretend that taxes are somehow not in the story, and we're only choosing between raising the ceiling on the debt and cutting spending. It's as if you were walking in an alley somewhere and a nasty person jumped out of the dark and said, I'm going to give you a free choice. I'll either shoot you or I'll stab you. I hope none of the people listening are going to be wondering, gee, what would I choose? The answer is not which one I choose. The answer is, I don't accept this presentation of my alternatives. How about you neither shoot nor stab me, because I would like to live? The American people are now having to say, how about we talk about taxes? Who pays them? Who doesn't? Who's gotten away with a tax cut? Who didn't get one? And then we can fix this problem without having to borrow. All of that is off the table. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, the Democrats are complicit. They don't bring up taxes either. They keep talking about spending, how terrible it would be if we didn't honor our debts. We must borrow more money, and we don't want to cut spending. As if the tax side of this equation, which is taught to every freshman studying economics, it's as if they've all had a sudden case of selective amnesia, and they do not remember what they know is the balance that has to be dealt with here between taxes and spending.
Well, I know our friends in modern monetary theory would say that that deficits don't matter. But when I hear people say that deficits do matter, and talking to you has reinforced this perception, my response has increasingly been then two things we can't afford are bankers and billionaires. That there's just no money. Sorry, there's just no money to let these people continue. That we should tax at 100%. Over $1 billion, and that the banking sector, financial sector, is just extracting too much wealth and driving this deficit. So you guys got to go. That's my conclusion.
It's I love it, because instead of telling poor people on Medicaid or elderly people with limited budgets on Social Security, sorry, there's not enough money, when we all know there is, why do we not say to the billionaires, we don't have enough money in this society to have Elon Musk with $150 billion or Jeffrey Bezos with $150 billion. We don't have enough money to indulge that level of obscene wealth. We can take the $300 billion you guys have, leave you with $1 billion. We're going to be generous. You have $1 billion. Play with that. But the rest, no, that's something we need, because millions of Americans who need medical care and millions of Americans who need a Social Security check are a greater concern in a democracy than the wealth of a handful of individuals. I don't know of any modern major religion or any modern major ethical or moral code that wouldn't be in agreement with what I just said. That's why it's so obscene when the money is sitting right there, not to tax it and give the public support to the people who need it, avoid borrowing so we're not all saddled with debts we have to pay off. Modern monetary theory is right. If the government used money in a different way when there wasn't a need to borrow and you didn't have to go through the charade of letting the Federal Reserve print money, lend it to the government, all of that crap we don't need. They're right. We could have a monetary system not wrapped up with debt. And we should, but as long as we don't, then we have to face this relationship between taxes, the relationship between taxes and spending, and stop misleading the American people into thinking that the taxes are somehow not part of this discussion. That is a terrible disservice that the Republicans do, and it's a terrible disservice that the Democrats are complicit with doing by being afraid, because that's what it is, afraid to bring up the tax issue. They don't seem to want to offend the donors, and those are the only people for whom this tax issue is what they want kept off the table.
Well, I think we solved it. But no, I really appreciate those insights. As always, Richard Wolff. And as always, I thank you so much for your time and for coming on the program.
And I don't want this to sound like a love fest, but RJ, I very much appreciate your program. Above all, that you are so continuously willing to go after these so-called controversial issues and allow dissident perspectives to get an airing. It's a remarkable service which the country needs probably now more than ever.
Well, I thank you for that. And we'll speak again soon, I hope. And We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.